All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, here at the Book Club of California and online on Zoom. Welcome to the Book Club of California's live and online exhibition opening for visual poetry. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here. For those of you who might be new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition, finely made books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and much, much more. So if you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. And if you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed, I strongly encourage you to consider membership. Our dues are modest, the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work that we do without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go to our website at bccbooks.org. Now tonight, we open our latest exhibition titled Visual Poetry. Poets, scribes, and printers throughout history have taken advantage of the fact that poetry is both a visual and a verbal art form. This exhibition features items from our very own Special Collections Library, and it examines some of the multi-sensory works from the earliest known shaped poems up to modern experiments in textual design. Now, we want to make sure you have time to view the exhibition, but first, Elizabeth Newsom, the book club's librarian, will share some insights into the items that are on display in our exhibition cases. In terms of our logistics this evening, we have people joining us on Zoom, and we have people here in person. And we'll be taking questions and comments on Zoom using the chat and the Q&A function. Now, we should have time at the end of the hour. I don't think we're going to be here for a full hour with some brief remarks, but we will take questions and comments curated from the chat and the Q&A, and also take questions from people here live at the book club. And now, without further ado, please welcome Elizabeth Newsom, the librarian for the Book Club of California.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to the opening of this visual poetry exhibition. Sorry, I'm not used to Macs, folks.
Is that what you need?
This is what I need. Thank you. This is the Phaistos disc, which is a fired clay disc found in the Minoan Palace of Phaistos on Crete. It's thought to have been made around 1700 BCE. The text on it is linear A. And if you're thinking, wait a minute, linear A hasn't been deciphered, why is this in your poetry exhibit? You're not wrong. However, we do have some clues to its meaning. Based on the similarity of the symbols to those of linear B, it appears to be a poem in honor of a pregnant and glowing goddess, while similarities to Proto-Finno-Ugaric would suggest a poem to a sun god. So while we don't actually know what this poem says, we can tell that there's a definite theme, and it's one that suits the shape. Much of what remains to us of classical and Byzantine Greek poetry was preserved in a few variants of an anthology, helpfully titled Greek Anthology, first assembled in the 1st BCE by Meleager of Gadara, in which he collected what he felt were the most important Greek poems to be passed down to later generations. That's where the word anthology comes from. Anthologia means flower gathering. And in this collection, he put together all of the flowers that he gathered out of the wide field of Greek poetry. Included in it are the oldest shaped poems that we can translate of Western poets, 3 of them being by Simmias of Rhodes, the 3rd century poet. His poem Axe was almost certainly written to be inscribed onto an axe head, like the ceremonial axe here. Another of his poems is Egg, and this one is technically ambitious in every possible way. It was likely written later in his career as a much more complex undertaking. As with Acts, the first lines to be read are the shortest, and then each pair of lines as they grow longer. Unlike in Acts, though, the complexity of the meter, the rhythmic structure of the poem, grows with each line as well. For the literature scholars out there, it increases from a trochaic monometer catalectic to a complicated decameter of spondees, anapasts, peons, and dactyls. I did not come up with that myself. And while he was writing a poem about a nature scene, he also manages to constantly pun on words used in metrical analysis to make sure that his readers are picking up on what he's doing. There's one more thing about egg that's even more impressive than axe, which was written to be inscribed on an axe. And I bet you can guess where this was first written. On an egg. The poem begins by telling us, "Behold a nightingale egg." So while Simmias deserves a lot of credit for writing this poem, we definitely need to give some to the scribe who copied this onto an egg roughly 1/3 the size of a chicken egg. So jumping forward about 600 years, we come to the poet Optatian, who wrote a series of visual poems circa 323 or 324 CE. At the time of their creation, he was living in exile. Why, we don't know. But he wrote these visual poems in praise of Emperor Constantine I, who liked them well enough to bring him out of exile and make him the court poet in 325. He was an innovator in versus in texti, or woven verses, like we see here, where he uses the appearance of the page to create a second poem, reading only the highlighted letters. So this is the first Christian poem that we've looked at. And I wanted to point out that this appears barely over a decade after Constantine won control of the Roman Empire and converted it to Christianity. This poet is someone who would have lived through the great persecution that didn't end until Constantine became emperor. And the symbols that he uses in his poetry are some of the symbols that Christians would have used while they were hiding from persecution. And by centering it in the text, he's drawing attention to the fact that while they could be hidden, they no longer have to be. So where the previous poems we've looked at have been enhanced by their shapes, Optatian makes the visual aspect of his poems something truly essential. These woven verses continue to be quite popular throughout the Middle Ages. Here we have 2 or 4, depending on how you look at it, poems by 9th century scholar and Archbishop Rabanus, who took the form developed by Optatian and ran with it. So it doesn't look like it, but this is a poem of just 4 lines. Starting at the center C, the reader can work outward towards each branch, and whichever meandering path is followed, the same sentence is created. 6th century Italian Bishop Fortunatus wrote 11 books of poetry, and this is the one that stuck. It was widely copied throughout the Middle Ages and widely printed as soon as it could be. Hugely popular, so much so that it was sometimes attributed to St. Thomas Aquinas, because something this cool obviously has to have a big name behind it, right? So why would a scribe in Milan decide to change it? This version appears in 3 Milanese manuscripts from the 12th century. It's different, but similar enough to definitely be a variant of Fortunatus's poem. So the poems that we've looked at reflect the impulse to transcend the purely verbal by working into the visual realm. What we're looking at here is an effort to transcend both of those and to bring the poem out into the physical world and to one particular church. The reconstruction of the Basilica di Sant'Ambrogio took place in the 11th and 12th centuries. And here is its floor plan. Each column and row of letters matches up with the pillars in the basilica. So someone who begins at the center crossing of the church and walks in any direction can look at the space surrounding them and walk through the physically embodied poem. Jumping forward another few centuries, we come to one of the most famous and beloved shaped poems in all of Western literature, George Herbert's Easter Wings. The Renaissance had seen a revival of shaped poetry that continued growing into the Baroque era, which is when Herbert wrote his poems. Easter Wings is distinguished by a skilled pairing of theme to shape, with each diminishing line meditating on sorrow and each growing line a reflection of joy. Shortly before his death in the year 1633, he sent a manuscript of all of his poetry to a friend, telling him, "Publish or burn." Luckily for us, his friend chose well. Shaped poetry was becoming popular with literary theorists as well as with poets and readers. In The Art of English Poesy, published in 1587, George Putnam very helpfully provided a list of what shapes were considered acceptable for poetry to take. And there we can see the triquet displayed that Herbert used for his wings. However, not everyone listened to Putnam. This was the Baroque era, and these shapes that you're looking at are not exactly distinguished by a high level of ornamentation. So while poets were going to town with their shapes, there was also a growing number of writers objecting to the style, with the main complaint being that because poets were forcing their words into particular shapes, the quality of the writing and the poetry itself suffered. The German writer Johann Frisch attacked them for the despicable uncleanliness of the false art of poetry and rhyme. Johann was not a man with a great deal of forethought. In his attacks on shaped poetry, he created some pattern poems to show how bad they are, and guess what he's remembered for today? The backlash to shaped poetry began earlier in England than it did in Germany, and not a single known pattern poem can be definitely attributed to the entire 18th century. And when they started to cautiously return in the 19th, The Mouse's Tale from Alice in Wonderland is one of only two written in that century to which a writer was willing to put a name. It's also the only English language poem that can really rival Easter Wings for the title of most famous. This is an amusing piece of verse, very charming to look at, but when you read Alice in Wonderland, you'll notice this doesn't fit very well thematically with the rest of the chapter. And there is a very good reason for that. The manuscript had an entirely different poem. In the original poem, the text turns with the curve in the mouse's tail. However, it got to the printer who was less enamored of the design than the writer was. And Carroll ended up writing a replacement with an eye towards the practicality of letterpress. In 1897, a revolutionary visual poem was printed. Symbolist poet and critic Stéphane Mallarmé intended his work, A Throw of the Dice Will Never Abolish Chance, to be taken in as a single image. And in this sense, it is in keeping with earlier visual poetry, but obviously it's also something entirely new. In describing his point in working with it, he said, "The white space indeed takes on importance and are initially striking. Ordinarily, versification required them around like silence. I do not transgress this measure, only disperse it. The paper intervenes each time an image of its own accord ceases or withdraws, accepting the succession of others." Most symbolist poets were more interested in exploring the relationship of poetry to music than the relationship between text and appearance, and so this was not immediately influential. With the clarity of hindsight, however, we can recognize and appreciate it for the truly innovative work that it is. Poet, critic, and author Guillaume Apollinaire began writing in 1900 and paused only to serve in World War I, where he sustained a severe head injury from which he never recovered. He returned to writing as soon as he could, and The Songbird appears in his final book, Calligrams, which is another name for shaped poetry, which was published shortly after his death in 1918. While he creates shapes with his poetry, it's in a completely new method, using the words to draw the outline rather than filling in the shape. And while many, like this one, could be read aloud, others were purely visual works. And these were interspersed with traditionally formatted poetry in which he meditated upon his horrific experiences during the war. In his manifesto, Italian futurist Marinetti stated that art, in fact, can be nothing but violence, cruelty, and injustice. He argued that in the service of progress, all association with the past must be violently destroyed, even arguing that Italians must stop eating pasta, promoting the demolition of historic architecture, the closure of museums and libraries, and the liberation of words. His principles for this liberation include, among other things, the abolition of adjectives and adverbs and the use of infinitive verb forms. And these rules were to free words from grammatical and syntactical rules at the same time as they were being freed from traditional modes of communication. TSF, telephones without wires, published in 1914, celebrates the new and futuristic wireless medium. So some of aspects of his work were and have remained influential. And this poem is striking and intriguing, and it's only reasonable that later poets would find inspiration in its design. Other aspects were not so popular. His celebration of violence and destruction in service to a single-minded march towards the future might sound fascist to you because it is fascist, and he was a fascist. And with the fall of Mussolini, Marinetti's plans for the future of art fell through as well. So I'd like to take a moment to look at the two of these. Published 4 years apart, they bear very little visual similarity, but they draw upon a shared realization that the nature of printing is changing, and upon a shared belief that the appearance of the text plays an important role in its appreciation. So just looking here, which one of these two would you expect to be a fan of the fine press movement? Yes, yes, Michelle is right. Yes. Apollinaire wrote that his poems were meant to be an idealization of free verse poetry and typographical precision in an era when typography is reaching a brilliant end to its career. And while Apollinaire thought his poems were the swan song of a dying technology, Marinetti looked at the rise of the recent fine press movement, where people are setting individual pieces of type and they're inking it by hand and dampening their paper and pulling a single sheet at a time. And this is so different from the Victorian era mechanical methods of production. He thought, here's something totally new and innovative, and he felt it had a real part to play in the future that he envisioned. Completely inaccurate in historical terms, but remember, this is the guy who was opposed to the existence of libraries. Speaking of libraries, let's look into the book club's archival collections. These are two lovely pieces by Lisa Rappaport of the Literal Press on the left and Mark Knudsen of the Elmwood Press on the right. Lisa describes the appeal of printing visual poetry. The words are on the page. The letters are the words and are within the words. Where does the meaning reside? Visual poetry amplifies meaning and adds its own stratum to the layers. It's a mostly untapped dimension which can be playful, startling, or profound, or all three at once. For me, as a letterpress printer, generally obedient to the constraints of the grid, it's a means of liberating the text and myself from the tyranny of rectilinear forms. So what is the future of visual poetry? There's a growing number of multimedia visual poets who are expanding into the digital realm or incorporating digital elements, while others are exploring new ways of incorporating traditional methods of production to create strikingly new forms. I'd like to be finished by looking at two artists whose work I saw at Codex. This is Alive, Alive by Thad Higa. By turning the bars at the bottom, the text displayed in the window scrolls through to display a quote by Martha Graham. He printed this last fall at the Eucalyptus Press, one of the Bay Area's venerable fine presses. And he also does really amazing multimedia work with what appears to be seamless transitions. And finally, I'd like to look at two poems by Monica Ong. Dark Side of the Moon was inspired by Chinese-American physicist Chen-Xiong Wu and offers a meditation on women's labor as a map of the dark side of the moon. The moon's surface is blind embossed onto the paper, and she uses the text to cluster around the valleys and offer the reader various texts for exploration of this unknown surface. And the volvelle is a 1,000-year-old structure that was created for use in astronomy books for calculating the positions of various astronomical bodies, with the moon being a common subject. Ong has created a lunar volvelle that is an interactive poem. As the moon reveals its ever-changing shape, so too does the poem that radiates from the volvelle's heart. So I'd like to thank you once again for coming. There will be a digital version going live tomorrow, which includes all of the materials on display and also more that I was not able to fit in. So if you're in the remote audience, please check that out. And if you're in the in-person audience, please look at that too, because there's so much more wonderful stuff in our collection. And you'll be able to find a link at the top of our website, bccbooks.org. I would particularly like to thank her and Kim, whose assistance with both physical and digital exhibits has been invaluable, and the Elmwood, Kelsey Street, and Arion presses, without whose work this exhibition would not have been possible. Thank you.
Don't go away.
Oh, yeah.
Don't go away. Stay right here on camera and
hi.
see if we can take some questions. Does anybody have any questions from the audience? Any comments?
What language were the first poems in there?
The Feistus disc is linear A, so an unknown Minoan language. And then the axe and the egg are both in Greek. And then after that, mostly Latin until we get to Herbert.
There is another question here. There's one here on Zoom. And it says, can you describe the difference, if any, between visual poetry and concrete poetry? Or do you consider them the same?
I do not consider them the same, but I consider concrete poetry one subset of visual poetry. Concrete poetry is specifically where the letters form the shape of the thing that it's about. So axe, egg, Easter wings is pushing it, but it is.
Other questions?
Kevin, to what extent, Elizabeth, to what extent do the beat poets take advantage of this art form?
They definitely explored it more in the layout and typography choices rather than experimenting with the shape. We do have some things in the case that are more similar to what the beat poets did. And Kenneth Patchen in particular was a poet, the beginning of the beat era, who originally was working in other types of multimedia. He would recite poetry over a jazz background. After he was injured in a terrible surgical mishap, he was pretty much confined to bed for the rest of his life. And so he started laying in bed and doing painted poems. Yeah.
Yeah, is there any style of font or typographical mode that poets tend to favor, or?
Let's repeat the question.
Yes, sure. The question was, is there any type of font or typographical mode that poets tend to favor? And if there is, I have not come across it looking at the materials for this.
Other questions here in the room? Can you comment, this is from Zoom, can you comment on a visual poem that is difficult to read? The Uso poem that looks difficult to read.
Oh, yeah. How do we go back?
Down here. How many far back?
About halfway.
We're-
That one.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is sort of an intermediate difficulty. My inclination would be to just start with the larger type at its tail, and then since the words do run pretty much in one direction, fanning along its wings, I would follow it that way. But I have not actually sat down and read it. And it's also possible that there is no single direction that it's meant to be read.
Other questions? Are you aware of any critical frameworks for visual poetry and why some work better than others?
Oh, gosh. There are a lot of critical frameworks, and I think the definition of what makes a visual poem work is incredibly difficult. It ties in quite significantly to the question of the value of occasional poetry, where a poem is written for a specific event, which tend to be denigrated in that they're not the absolute peak of literary perfection, but that's not necessarily the goal. And in visual poetry, the goal is not necessarily to reach the peak of literary perfection. The goal is to reach a harmony where both text and visual aspects share in giving meaning to the work.
Other questions here in the room? No. Something you and I talked about was not playing that whole video, but everybody wants to see the whole video.
Oh, sure.
So,
It is really cool.
so we're going to play that video and then we're going to probably wrap up here.
There we go.
Is that the end?
Yeah.
That's the
That's
that's
the
the
end
end.
of the video.
It goes pretty fast. Please join me in thanking Elizabeth for putting together this great exhibition. And Elizabeth will be around if you have questions for her. And thank you again for joining us for this book club exhibition opening. It's been a while since we've had an in-person exhibition, so I'm delighted to see everyone here. For coming. Our next program is a hybrid event. It's going to have an in-person audience like tonight and a Zoom component. And that's going to be on Monday, July 11th. So in a couple weeks from now. And it's titled Lambeth Palace Library Through 5 Centuries. That's a co-presentation by the Bibliographical Society of America. And this will be a talk by Giles Mandelbrot. He's the librarian and archivist for the Lambeth Palace Library. And he's going to be here in person. So you can attend this event and any of our events by using the links that you're getting in the emails from the Book Club of California, or you can go to our website at bccbooks.org/programs, again, to register for any of our in-person or virtual events. So thank you all for being with us here in the room and on Zoom this evening. We look forward to seeing you again in person or in the virtual world for another Book Club of California presentation. Thank you, everyone. Stay healthy and have a great night.